All right, hi ladies, and welcome to our phylogenetic tree note video. So the first thing I want to do is just get some definitions. Phylogenetics is a method of classifying organisms by the characteristics that they have in common and showing evolutionary changes over time. So kind of how we talked about all the different kingdoms of life over here, the 3 domains of life are in boxes, and then we also have the kingdoms for the eukarya domain. We were able during our activities and learning about these kingdoms to figure out what things they had in common, how they were different. So this is a way for us to show what they have in common and also how they evolved over time. So when you're reading phylogenetic trees, let's go ahead and define that. A phylogenetic tree is a diagram that shows evolutionary relationships. When you read phylogenetic trees, the thing that is the lowest is typically the oldest. So bacteria were the oldest things to become species. Then archaea came to be, then protists, then plants, then fungi, and finally animals. So animals are the most recent thing to come about. So I'm going to show you a phylogenetic tree, and then we can maybe come back to this example. So when you're looking at phylogenetic trees, we call these, on the sides, we call these branches. And branches represent the divergence of a species. So these up here, A, B, C, D, and E, are all different species. They have characteristics that are unique to only them, and they share some type of history with each other, with letter A, and with their common ancestor. So like I said before, phylogenetic trees, we read them from past to most recent. So letter E would be our most recent to become a species. And letter A would be our oldest species, or the species that became a species the longest ago. So these all of these species share a common ancestor, and that's an important part of phylogenetic trees, is that we build them around a common ancestor. Each of these little branches where a new branch is formed, that shows what we call speciation, or the formation of a new species. Letter A represents what we call an outgroup, or the least closely related species to these other species. And that's because they separated off the tree first, right? They came right off of the common ancestor. There are no other branches before them. They are the least closely related to everybody else. Then we have what are called derived characters. And those are characteristics or traits that separate different species. We also call them nodes. So when you see them on a phylogenetic tree, we refer to these as nodes. But you should know that a node is a derived characteristic or trait. So how I read phylogenetic trees is I like to think about it as a highway. And each node is an exit. So we know that a node is a derived characteristic. Let's say that this node represents the trait of fur. So if a species has fur, it can pass that exit. It gets to keep driving. If the species does not have fur, it can't pass this exit or this node because it doesn't have that derived characteristic. So if you don't have that characteristic, you can't pass this exit. So you become your branch and you hang out up here. So letter A, we would say, does not have fur. It goes up here on its own branch. Letter B does have fur, so it can go through the exit. And maybe this next node is claws. I don't know. So if it has fur but doesn't have claws, then it takes this branch. So B has fur, it can pass that exit, but it doesn't have claws, so it has to turn back around and go up here. Now, letter C does have fur, does have claws, and we can put that right here. Normally, there would be nodes for each one of these speciations. When we form a new species, there's normally a derived characteristic there. So typically we would have one right here, but we don't in this example. So C, D, and E all have fur and claws. Now, D and E, because they are the most recent and they have the most characteristics in common, we would call those the most closely related. So D and E are the most closely related species that we have. Now, there are two ways that we can draw phylogenetic trees. The first way is how you just saw it. This is the other way. So common ancestors go at the bottom. Then you have your outgroups, which are the least closely related species to everything else. And then we show the most closely related species at the top of our phylogenetic tree, or in this case, it's at the bottom. But that's because these two share all of this history. And these two share all of this history. So let's look at an example. We can put some names to this idea. So we have all of our different species up at the top, and we have our nodes or our derived characters, and pretty much always you'll see the trait that it's talking about that derived at these specific points on our phylogenetic tree. So if we take our highway, we know our common ancestors down here. We take our highway. Hagfish do not have jaws, right? They're not able to go through here. So that's why they are up here. This would also be our outgroup. They are the least closely related to everything else because they're the closest to the common ancestor and they don't have any of these other traits that these guys all share. So if we look at the perch, we would see that they have jaws, but they do not have lungs, right? They're able to take the jaw exit, but they don't have lungs, so they turn around, and that's why they are right here. For salamanders, we would see that they have jaws, lungs, but they don't have claws, right? They can't pass this exit. That's why they reside in this space. And we can do that for the rest of these, right? So you can see here that feathers is actually on one of our branches for our species. And that can happen sometimes if we don't want to, if we want to include a specific species, but we don't want to make a whole nother phylogenetic tree because there are a lot of things that have feathers, right? So we can put that there if we're trying to show pigeons' relationship to these other organisms. The reason that we put that there is because none of these have feathers, right? It wouldn't make sense for us to put feathers here because mice don't have feathers and chimps don't have feathers. So when we're looking at this phylogenetic tree, we would be able to say that mice and chimps are the most closely related because they share all of these traits with the exception of feathers, right? They have fur, mammary glands, claws and nails, lungs, and jaws. So they are the most closely related. The chimp is the most recent species to develop. So the last part of this note video is something I'm not gonna quiz you on, but I just want you to know about going forward in your science career. So there's this thing called phyletic groups, and that's a group that includes a common ancestor and all of the descendants, both living and extinct, of that ancestor. So typically, phyletic groups, they have to be shown with a node or a derived characteristic, and they have to have a direct path to the common ancestor. So these two, because they share this common trait and have a direct path to the common ancestor, these two would be considered a phyletic group. If we look over here, this node represents some derived characteristic. All of these have that characteristic and share this common ancestor, so that would also be a phyletic group. I know this is a little bit confusing, and I'm going to link a couple videos in our Unit 2 page that's on Canvas that will hopefully help you if you want to understand this more. I just want you to be aware that this is a thing, but I'm not going to quiz you on it, okay? I want you to be able to look at phylogenetic trees and talk to me about the characteristics. I want you to be able to build a phylogenetic tree, things like that. I don't really care so much about the phyletic groups. I'm not going to ask you about that because it does get kind of confusing. So really quickly, before we end the notes, I want to take you back to our domain of life phylogenetic tree. So you can see our 3 domains and then our kingdoms for the eukarya section. And each of these is a node, right, or a characteristic that derived, that created that species. So now that we know a little bit about phylogenetic trees, we know that bacteria is our outgroup, animals is our most recent species to develop. In this case, we're going to say kingdom, right, because we know that animals can be broken down further. And fungi and animals are the most closely related, which sounds kind of crazy, but we're most closely related to fungi. That's because we share all of these derived characters and are the most recent to become species. If you have any questions, feel free to stop by. You're going to do a little bit of practice with some worksheets, and we'll practice a little bit in class also. But if you have any questions, send me an email or talk to me in class.